I've shared this tale before, but here it is again. My memory might add a bit of color, but this is how I recall it from around 12 years ago. Back then, I was trekking through the Andes Mountains. We were a group of about 25, if my memory serves me right. Our routine was straightforward. Hike all day, set up camp at sunset, and repeat the process daily, slowly ascending higher into the mountains. The campsites were pre-designated spots. As we climbed to the upper altitudes, some of these sites were fenced off and guarded by local rangers. On the fourth night, I developed an upset stomach. Around midnight, I couldn't hold it any longer and had to heed nature's call. I asked my friend to accompany me, and we made our way to a nearby guard post. The ranger stationed there was fast asleep, bundled tightly in a thick coat. We didn't want to disturb him, so we decided to quietly open the gate. The gate was secured with just a chain, not locked, so we unwrapped it and stepped out. The sight that greeted us was breathtaking. The Milky Way stretched across the sky like a glittering river. I found a spot near a glacier that had carved its way down the slopes, leaving a bare trail where trees once stood. The crisp air, the crystal clear water, and that starlit sky. It felt like a scene from another world. After taking in the beauty of the moment and handling my urgent matter, we started back toward our tents, still captivated by the vastness above. Just as we neared the tents, a sharp whistle cut through the silence. The night guard was awake. We remembered the strict instructions. No one was to leave their tents after dark for any reason. Fear gripped us, and we decided not to risk an explanation. Instead, we slipped back into our tent and lay down, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Moments later, we heard footsteps circling our tent. Frozen with fear, we stayed silent, hearts racing, and eventually drifted into an uneasy sleep. Morning arrived with chaos. A senior ranger had come to the site and was shouting at everyone, his voice echoing through the camp. The night guard had gotten into trouble because someone had left the gate open. A bear had wandered into the campsite during the night. Luckily, it caused no damage. When we heard this, my friend and I exchanged nervous glances. Tracks around our tent and throughout the camp sent shivers down our spines. We stayed silent, too terrified to admit what we had done. To this day, only the two of us know how narrowly we escaped a potentially disastrous encounter. That experience taught me to respect the wilderness deeply. While it wasn't a direct confrontation, knowing that the footsteps we heard were those of a bear, and not the guard, still gives me chills. I live near the Cedarvale Nature Preserve. There are trails not far from my house that lead into those hills. It was a misty evening, and after receiving some tough news over a call, I decided to clear my mind with a hike under the night sky. I set out at about 7:45 p.m., with melancholy tunes playing in my earbuds and a small backpack carrying water and a few essentials. I didn't plan to be out too long, but was sure I'd be walking for a while. At first, the hike was peaceful. The mist gave the environment a ghostly yet serene quality. It felt unique, almost magical. All I could hear was the soft drip of moisture sliding off leaves along the trail. There wasn't a single soul in sight. It felt like the whole world was mine. I didn't use my flashlight. The mist reflected the beam, cutting my view down to only a few feet and ruining my night vision. It was better to let my eyes adjust to the dim light from the distant glow of the town below. After about an hour, things took a strange turn. I had gone roughly 2 miles into the trail when I first noticed an odd smell. It was faint but artificial, almost like a whiff of perfume. Came and went in an instant, leaving me puzzled. Not long after, I smelled smoke, like from a campfire. That was strange since there weren't any campsites nearby. I brushed it off and kept moving. A while later, another scent hit me, a nostalgic one. It reminded me of summers spent playing outside as a kid. I couldn't put my finger on it, but it left me feeling unsettled. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I noticed a flicker of light. It was faint, like a flashlight beam cutting through the mist, coming from higher up the ridge, 50 or 100 feet above me. It resembled the glow of an airplane light passing through clouds, dimming and brightening as it moved. To my knowledge, there weren't any trails up there. Curious and uneasy, I stopped and took out my earbuds. Silence. The light moved methodically, turning on and off as if someone were scanning the area. I stayed still, watching it pass, and convinced myself it was another hiker struggling with the same poor visibility. A few minutes later, I heard whistling. It was faint, like someone calling a pet from far away. Turning toward the sound, I could just barely make out the glow of the light across the canyon, about a quarter mile away. I watched it for a moment before continuing my trek. After another hour of hiking, I paused for water. The ground had turned sandy and crunchier underfoot, and the higher elevation, around 3,000 feet, meant the town lights were now barely visible. My footsteps echoed in the silence, making me hyper-aware of how alone I was. At a bend in the trail, I reached a scenic overlook. It was a small clearing that jutted out over the valley, offering a view, though the fog obscured most of it. I stepped off the path to rest, checking my phone to see if any delayed texts had come through. Nearby, someone had built a small stone pile with a stick balanced on top, like a little sculpture. I stayed there for a couple of minutes, deciding whether to keep going or turn back. As I looked down at my phone, I suddenly heard quick footsteps. 5 of them, coming from the trail. They sounded human, like someone running directly toward me, then stopping abruptly. Heart racing, I spun around, but nothing was there. Silence. I fumbled for my flashlight and knife, shining the beam into the fog. The mist reflected the light back at me, revealing nothing but emptiness. It wasn't the sound of an animal. It was deliberate, like a person sprinting and then freezing in place. Terror surged through me. I was alone, miles into the wilderness, and something or someone was out there. I stood frozen, flashlight trembling in my grip, scanning the fog. After what felt like an eternity, I decided to head back. The footsteps had come from the direction of the trail, the only way back to safety. I walked cautiously, my light sweeping ahead. Every few minutes, I'd stop and listen, convinced I heard faint steps echoing mine. Whatever it was seemed to match my pace, staying just out of sight. At one point, I heard a loud rustling in the bushes on the steep canyon side to my right. I jumped and moved to the opposite edge of the trail, heart pounding, but didn't stop to investigate. The descent was the most focused I'd ever been. Every shadow, every sound made my nerves flare. I didn't stop until I reached my car, collapsing inside and locking the doors immediately. I haven't gone back to that trail at night. Once, I did hike it during the day, with bright sunshine and a larger knife strapped to my side. But I'll never forget that night in the Misty Hills. A haunting memory etched into my mind forever. My spouse, child, and I live far out in the countryside on a piece of land about 100 acres in size. Around 95 of those acres are dense woods, with trails for hiking and riding ATVs that we and some previous landowners created just by exploring over the years. We used the property for activities like hiking, hunting, and camping. Often we'll pick a spot, clear it out a bit, and camp overnight. The land is so vast that we've never camped in the same spot twice. Along the way, we've come across evidence of wildlife, old and fresh kill sites, animal tracks, and places where deer had bedded down, among other things. I also enjoy hiking on my own when our child is at school and my spouse is working. Whether I'm alone or with my family, we always carry a firearm for safety. A few weeks ago, we packed up our camping gear and decided to explore a new area. We marked our progress by spray painting trees along the trails we created. After about an hour of hiking, the atmosphere shifted. It's hard to say who noticed first, but my spouse, who was leading, stopped and turned back with a concerned expression. The usual sounds of the forest, birds chirping, insects buzzing, had disappeared. Everything was eerily silent, which is never a good sign in the wilderness. We continued walking, paying closer attention to our surroundings while our child kept chattering away, oblivious. Eventually, we reached a stream that marks the halfway point on our property. We stopped for a break, and my spouse and I exchanged uneasy glances. Something didn't feel right. I finally broke the silence, saying I didn't feel well and thought we should head back. My spouse agreed, though our child protested. Reluctantly, we turned around and started walking home. A few minutes into our return, still surrounded by an unnatural quiet, I glanced to my right and froze. About 150 feet off the trail, a person crouched low to the ground in a camouflaged ghillie suit. They didn't move but clearly knew I had seen them. I cleared my throat to get my spouse's attention. When they looked back, I rested my hand on the firearm at my hip, signaling them to be ready. My spouse adjusted their rifle and we quickened our pace, urging our child to move faster without alarming them. Once home, I told my spouse what I had seen. We decided to call the authorities to report the trespasser. They took our report and advised us to call again if we spotted anyone else. A few days later, my spouse and I returned to the woods alone to set up multiple trail cameras. We avoided the deeper parts of the property for about a week, but when we eventually went back to check the footage, we found 2 images of the person in the ghillie suit. We handed the pictures over to the police to add to the report. Since then, we've been reluctant to venture far into the woods, except to check the cameras, which haven't picked up anything unusual since. Thinking back, what unsettles me most are the times we camped out and heard footsteps near our tent at night. We always assumed it was just wildlife, but now I'm not so sure. I was hiking with my dog about 10 miles from the nearest road and trailhead. It was a remote spot, though the area was somewhat popular, so there was a chance other hikers might be around. However, we hadn't seen anyone all day. At around 1:30 a.m., my dog started growling, a low, deep growl that woke me up. I turned on my flashlight to see his teeth bared as he stood over me. Outside, I heard heavy footsteps. My first thought was that it might be a black bear or maybe even a large deer near the tent. I grabbed my dog to keep him from tearing through the tent. The footsteps moved away but then began circling us. I had hung all my food and scented items in a bear bag on a tree far from the tent, so there was no reason for a bear to be interested in us. I clapped my hands to scare whatever it was, but the slow circling continued. This didn't feel like something a deer would do. A bear might circle if it was looking for food, but I had nothing in the tent, and I had a large dog with me. I decided to step outside, leash in one hand and a can of pepper spray in the other. I shouted loudly, "Hey bear!" The footsteps stopped. My dog sniffed the air and turned towards something to my right, but I couldn't see anything in the beam of my flashlight. There was no sound of anything running away, just silence. After a few minutes, I went back inside the tent, but the footsteps started again, circling about 40 feet away. This went on for nearly an hour before I finally heard the sound of someone, or something, walking off into the woods. At dawn, I took my dog and pepper spray to investigate. We found a faint path of disturbed leaves but no clear tracks at first. My dog's nose led me in a loop around our campsite. Finally, I found what looked like human footprints, not shoe prints, just bare human feet, and nearby a pile of human waste with toilet paper. Some weirdo had been wandering around my tent in the middle of the night, circling us for over an hour before leaving a disgusting surprise for me to find. I've been hiking for years, and this is the only truly bizarre experience I've ever had. Most hikers are friendly and respectful, but in recent years, I've noticed more litter and bad habits like people not burying waste or leaving dog poop bags on the trail. The area I was in was very remote. It didn't make sense for anyone dangerous to hike that far just to cause trouble. Serious hikers don't usually carry toilet paper either, so I didn't think it was malicious. The strangest thing I've heard of was a mentally disturbed individual who attacked hikers on the Appalachian Trail several years ago. But that was an isolated case, and I've never had any dangerous encounters with people while hiking. I also don't carry a gun, too much extra weight for multi-day hikes. In the Northeast, the largest predators are black bears, coyotes, and bobcats, all of which generally avoid humans. If I were hiking in areas with grizzlies, mountain lions, or wolves, I might carry a gun. Moose are another matter. They're massive and fearless, especially during mating season. You'd need a powerful firearm to stop one, and that's just not practical to carry. I've crossed paths with moose 3 times, and you usually hear them crashing through the brush long before you see them. Fortunately, I've never had a close encounter with one. As for this incident, as much as I'd love to blame it on a cryptid like Bigfoot or a skinwalker, I think it was just a confused hiker. My guess is they wandered off to relieve themselves, got lost, and accidentally ended up near my tent. I was camping in a designated backcountry area, where you're required to set up at least 200 feet off the trail. It's possible someone was hiking the loop trail in the opposite direction, stopped for the night, and wandered off to use the bathroom. They probably heard my dog and me yelling and didn't want to respond, either out of embarrassment or fear. The circle they walked around my tent was several hundred feet, and the thick trees likely blocked their view of my campsite for most of it. I couldn't fall back asleep, but by sunrise, I felt more at ease. When I found the pile of waste, I was mostly relieved. It confirmed it was a human and not some predator stalking us. I didn't think anyone would be out there, given how remote the area was. To reach my campsite, you'd need to cross 2 mountain peaks from one direction or 6 from the other. This was part of a 35-mile loop we planned to complete over 3 nights and 4 days. After realizing it was a person, my first thought was that they might be lost. I texted a friend who works with search and rescue to check if there were any missing hikers reported. Since no one was missing, my dog and I packed up camp and continued our hike. A group of friends and I decided to go camping at a secluded pond near the woods. The hike was around 3 to 4 hours, and the closest house was a similar distance away. We brought some homemade cider and spent the evening drinking it, along with munching on some poorly roasted sausages. Everything felt perfect. We all squeezed into a single tent, which made it pretty cramped. Despite that, we fell asleep around 2 a.m. At about 4 a.m., I woke up to the unsettling sensation of someone stroking my forearm. At first, I thought one of my friends might have brushed against me accidentally. It wasn't impossible in such a crowded tent. But then I realized it was the arm facing the tent wall. Someone had touched me from outside. I bolted upright, my heart pounding, and immediately checked the tent. All my friends were sound asleep, their breathing slow and even. Summoning my deepest, most intimidating voice, I called out, "Whoever you are, leave us alone." To my shock, a calm but chillingly lifeless voice responded, "Pack your things and go." The tone wasn't threatening or loud, but there was something unnervingly dead about it. By now, all my friends were awake, their eyes wide with terror. None of us spoke, just exchanged panicked glances. Finally, I replied, "Okay, we're leaving. Just go away." "Be quick," the voice said, still eerily calm. When we stepped out of the tent, we saw him. A massive man, taller and broader than anyone I'd ever seen. He had taken a small wooden boat that had been lying by the shore, rowed it to the middle of the pond, and was just sitting there. He didn't speak or move, only watched us silently as we scrambled to pack up our things and leave as quickly as possible. Our path back to safety circled the pond, so for the entire walk, he stayed in the boat, his eyes following us the whole way. We never returned to that spot. This happened 15 years ago in a remote part of a northern European country. We weren't trespassing. Laws here allow public access to most natural areas. We had grown up in a nearby village where everyone knew each other. There had never been reports of missing people or violent crimes in generations. When we told our parents what happened, they tried to reassure us, saying we'd probably misunderstood the situation. But none of us could forget how that man had stroked my arm, or the eerie calmness in his voice. Years later, during a reunion, we brought up the incident and decided to dig deeper. There were no houses or cabins near that pond. It was too small for fishing, and there were no trails leading to it. The man and his tiny boat remain a complete mystery to this day. None of us have ever seen him again. To grasp the importance of this tale, you need to know a bit about me, so here's some background. I came into the world in 1955, meaning I spent my formative years in the cultural waves of the 1960s and early 1970s in a tiny rural town in northern Indiana. When I say tiny, I mean there was a single stoplight at the intersection of Main Street and First Avenue. The heart of the town had about 30 businesses, including a pharmacy with a soda fountain, a hardware store, a small grocery shop, a five-and-dime store, a gas station, and a barber shop. There were churches for the Baptist, Methodist, Lutheran, and Catholic communities, and nearly everyone attended one on Sundays. We also had a library, a small post office, and a jail that you could practically stroll through unnoticed. Most days, if someone was locked up, we'd peek in and sometimes run errands for them, fetching cigarettes or snacks, never really questioning why they were there. I was a curious, free-spirited, and adventurous kid with an innocent outlook on life. As I grew, so did the world's chaos. The assassination of JFK, the civil rights struggles, protests over Vietnam, and the rise of the hippie movement. I joined the latter wholeheartedly, becoming one of the early hippies. Hitchhiking was common then, and I traveled extensively across the US and Canada for more than 3 years, often without any money, spare clothes, or much thought to safety. Many people warned me about the risks, but being young, naive, and feeling invincible, I ignored them. One summer stands out vividly. It was June 1970, and I was 15. I spent the night at my friend Lena's house in a nearby town. I convinced her to join me on a trip to San Francisco. She had a brother out there she hadn't seen in a while, which made it easier to persuade her. We sneaked across a field to the highway and stuck out our thumbs to hitch a ride. Back then, it didn't take long for someone to stop. We caught several rides. A band's tour bus even offered to take us to Chicago, but it was too far out of the way, so we declined. I can't remember the band's name. Another time, we hopped into a Cadillac with 4 men and ended up at a lively party in a predominantly black neighborhood in Columbus, Ohio. We were the only white people there, but felt completely welcome. A kind woman gave me a shirt, which I now realize was likely to cover me up. Bless her heart. One ride was uneventful until we picked up another hitchhiker. He kept warning the driver about the trouble he could get into for taking 2 underage girls across state lines. His constant nagging annoyed me to the point I told him to zip it. Looking back, we should have left that car then, but we didn't. The driver stopped for gas in Iowa, and Lena and I went to freshen up. When we returned, police officers were waiting. We ended up in a small-town Iowa jail. Our parents were contacted, though I don't recall much of that part, and the officers treated us more like guests than prisoners. They played cards with us and brought snacks like candy and donuts. Before long, Lena's mom arrived to get us. After a long talk with her daughter, she decided to drive us the rest of the way to California, over 1,800 miles. I still can't believe she agreed to that. We sang along to the radio, especially to the Mamas and the Papas' California Dreamin', all the way to Nevada. We stayed at a hotel in Reno, which turned out to be dull and not what I'd imagined. I tried convincing Lena to ditch her mom and keep adventuring, but thankfully, she refused. Looking back, I'm grateful for her sense of responsibility. We finally made it to San Francisco, landing near Haight-Ashbury and Berkeley, where the hippie scene was buzzing. However, the reality overwhelmed me. I thought I was worldly for a small-town girl, but this was beyond anything I'd experienced. At places like Needle Park, I saw drug addiction up close, which terrified me. The things I witnessed there, some too disturbing to mention, shocked me to my core. I wanted to go home and have never returned to California since. Not long after we got back, I was sitting with my mom watching TV. It was July, and news broke about the Manson family and the gruesome murders they committed. That's when it hit me. I could have easily been picked up by them. If I'd gone off on my own that night instead of staying with Lena and her mom, I might have been hitchhiking alone, just hours from their base. What if the police hadn't stopped us in Iowa? We could have crossed paths with the Manson family, who were known to recruit in Haight-Ashbury. To this day, I'm deeply grateful that fate kept me from falling into that nightmare. At the time, I was the perfect target, young, naive, and impressionable. It's a chilling thought, and I've never forgotten how close I came. My name's Lucas, and this took place in 2001. I was on my way to visit some old friends and relatives back in my home city. I had relocated the year before due to a new job, so I tried to return and catch up with everyone whenever I could. The trip usually took around 6 hours, and I'd drive there after work, arriving at my dad's house late at night. Everything was going fine for the first couple of hours until, suddenly, smoke started billowing from the hood of my car. I quickly steered to the side of the road. I didn't know much about cars and didn't have a mobile phone with me. With no other choice, I decided to walk along the highway, hoping to find a service station or a call box for help. The sun was setting as I began walking, the glare hitting my eyes directly. It was around 6:30 p.m., and I knew darkness would soon set in. I felt uneasy about being stuck in such an isolated area after nightfall. Out of nowhere, I heard the rumble of a car behind me. It wasn't a busy road, so the sound caught my attention. I turned and stuck out my thumb, signaling for a lift. To my relief, the car slowed and pulled over. The driver, a man who looked to be in his mid-20s, offered me a ride. I gladly accepted, climbed into the passenger seat, and thanked him. First, everything seemed fine. We chatted, and it turned out we were close in age. But as the ride went on, I started noticing subtle changes in his behavior. It's hard to describe, but the atmosphere shifted. It felt tense, as if he was irritated with me for no apparent reason. I hadn't done anything to upset him, but it felt like a switch had flipped. I tried to lighten the mood with conversation, but he barely responded. Minutes passed in silence, and the unease in my chest grew. When we passed a gas station, I asked if we could stop. He ignored me completely, dismissing my request without explanation. That's when I knew something wasn't right. He glanced at me with a strange smile, and I forced a weak one back, trying to keep things calm. But deep down, I was sure his intentions weren't good. The farther we drove, the farther we got from my car and the station. Then, without warning, he turned onto a deserted country road. I asked where we were going, hoping for some logical answer, but he remained silent, his eyes locked on the road ahead. Eventually, he pulled the car to a stop. His face hardened, and he ordered me to get out, his voice carrying a menacing tone. I froze for a second before he broke into a chilling laugh. That laugh was the most unsettling part of the whole experience. Just as suddenly as he'd started laughing, he stopped and snarled, "Get out now. This is your last chance." I didn't argue. The guy was clearly unhinged. I stepped out and stood on the side of the road as he sped away, leaving me alone in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by open fields. Adrenaline surged through me. With the sun almost gone, I needed to find my way back to the main road quickly. I estimated we'd driven a few miles down the dirt path, so it would take at least an hour to walk back to the highway. When I finally reached the main road, the darkness had fully set in. Thankfully, the highway had streetlights, and I kept walking, determined to find help. After another hour, a car approached from behind. I hesitated but decided to flag it down. The driver, an older man, offered me a ride and dropped me off at a gas station where I could finally call for assistance. I didn't share this experience with anyone until a year later. That man was dangerous. I have no doubt he would have harmed me if I hadn't gotten out when I did. It felt like some twisted game to him, picking me up only to abandon me in such an isolated place. I imagine he laughed himself to sleep that night. Looking back, I wish I'd reported him to the authorities. He seemed like someone who might hurt someone else down the line. When I was 21 years old, I decided to hitchhike across the country. It was an adventure that led me through various terrains and gave me experiences that forever shaped how I view the world. I've got a few unnerving stories from that time, but looking back, this one stands out as the most frightening. I was a couple of years out of high school and had recently left my job working at a construction site in the middle of a hot summer. One day, during a stretch of my journey, I found myself standing on the side of a desolate road, my thumb pointed skyward in hopes of catching a ride. It was a smaller highway somewhere just north of Arlington, Texas. The sun bore down relentlessly as I waited, sweat pooling at the back of my neck. After nearly an hour, doubt began creeping in. I rarely waited this long for a ride. Just then, a battered, rusty sedan sputtered to a stop in front of me. I hesitated for a moment before approaching it cautiously, glancing at the two men seated in the front. They were rough-looking men in their late 40s, faces worn and etched with the kind of lines that spoke of hard, unforgiving lives. Despite my hesitation, I climbed into the back seat, thankful for a way to move forward on my journey. I'd met all sorts of people while hitchhiking, and sometimes appearances could be misleading. People who looked the toughest could turn out to be kind-hearted. As the car moved on, I tried to spark a conversation, but it was like talking to a couple of statues. The men barely acknowledged me. The silence was uncomfortable, but at least I wasn't baking under the sun anymore. I sat quietly, staring out the window as the car's interior filled with the smell of stale cigarettes and the faint mustiness of worn upholstery. Eventually, the men started talking to each other. At first, their conversation was casual, just small talk about the weather and road conditions. But before long, their tone shifted. They began discussing a robbery they had carried out. My stomach dropped. At first, I couldn't tell if they were joking, but their serious expressions left me tense and on edge. Why would they bring up something like that in front of a stranger unless they had some kind of plan for me? I felt a cold knot of fear settle in my chest. I didn't want to seem suspicious, so I tried my best to stay calm and act like their conversation didn't faze me. As the drive continued, their talk grew darker. They chatted about drugs and crime as though they were discussing mundane errands. They didn't even seem to notice I was there anymore. I felt trapped, afraid that they might try to involve me in their schemes, maybe even force me into something I couldn't refuse. Eventually, a small gas station appeared in the distance. Hope flared in me as I saw an opportunity to escape. I mustered the courage to speak up, telling them I needed to use the restroom. One of the men nodded, saying he needed to stop anyway. We pulled into the station, and all three of us got out. Nearby, there was a patch of trees. As we neared it, I suddenly bolted, running as fast as I could. I didn't look back until I was deep in the woods, but when I did, I saw them chasing me, shouting angrily. I caught words like rat and snitch and realized just how much danger I was in. I ran until my lungs burned, weaving through the trees, desperate to put as much distance as I could between me and them. Finally, their voices faded. I stayed hidden among the trees for what felt like an eternity, probably 20 or 30 minutes before peeking out. Their car was gone. I took a moment to steady my nerves and then made my way cautiously back to the gas station. An hour later, I managed to hitch a ride with a truck driver. He was friendly and dropped me off at a small roadside motel a few hours later. Despite the scare, I didn't stop hitchhiking. The journey continued, though I was a lot more cautious after that. Sadly, that wasn't the only time I had a frightening experience on the road. But those are stories for another time. A few months ago, I went out with some buddies one evening. We decided to explore a few pubs on the far side of the city from where I live. I was the one chosen to stay sober and drive for the night. Around 1:30 a.m., we decided to call it quits. We all piled into my car, and I dropped everyone off one by one. The last person to be dropped off was Liam. He lived farther away than the others, so after I left him at his place, I decided to take the highway home. The road was a quiet, narrow, two-lane stretch with a single lane going in each direction. Streetlights were sparse, leaving much of the road in darkness. As I drove along, I noticed a figure standing near the shoulder of the road. It was a young man around my age with a backpack slung over his shoulder. Without giving it much thought, I pulled over and offered him a ride. I assumed he was trying to get home after a night out. Maybe he didn't have a friend like me to stay sober and help. Cabs in that area would have cost a fortune. I stopped the car, and he squinted against the glare of my headlights as he approached. He climbed into the passenger seat, and after exchanging quick introductions, he told me where he needed to go. Not much conversation happened after that. I tried making small talk, but his answers were brief, and he kept staring straight ahead. The silence was heavy and awkward. After a few minutes, I saw him reaching into his bag from the corner of my eye. In seconds, he pulled out a gun and aimed it at me. I panicked and swerved, almost running the car off the road. Once I regained control, I glanced at him and noticed tears running down his cheeks. I was stunned. Part of me wanted to try reasoning with him, but I couldn't bring myself to say anything. He screamed at me to pull over and get out, which I did without hesitation. Standing on the roadside, I watched helplessly as he sped away in my car. I was stranded in the middle of nowhere. No other vehicles were around, and when I checked my phone, there was no signal. I had no choice but to start walking. As I trudged along, I couldn't help but see the irony. I had picked up a hitchhiker, only to be left walking on the roadside myself. About 30 minutes passed before I spotted headlights in the distance. I waved my arms desperately to flag the car down, praying they'd stop. It was the first vehicle I'd seen, and I wasn't sure if another would come anytime soon. Fortunately, the driver pulled over. I explained what had happened, and he immediately offered to call the police, but his phone didn't have service either. He promised to alert the authorities as soon as he could, but didn't let me into his car. Probably smarter than I had been. He drove off, and I stood there waiting. About half an hour later, the police arrived. I gave them every detail I could remember about the man who took my car. They drove me home, and as soon as I got there, I collapsed onto my bed. The next day, I got a call from the police. They had caught the guy and recovered my car. While I was relieved, there was a disturbing twist. They found bloodstains inside my car that didn't belong to the thief, and I knew they hadn't been there before. Whoever the blood belonged to, they weren't found. I couldn't stop wondering what had happened in my car. For weeks, my car was kept as evidence while the investigation continued. In the meantime, I had to use a rental. Eventually, the car was returned to me, but the mystery lingered. The hitchhiker was charged with stealing the car, but the source of the blood remained unknown. To this day, I get chills driving that car, not knowing what happened inside it that night. Sometimes, my mind spirals with possibilities, and I don't think I'll ever find peace about it.